Managing Director of New America's Next Social Contract Initiative. The Next Social Contract Initiative, for those of you who aren't familiar with our program, it's a program designed to offer ideas for modernizing the policies, institutions, and practices that exist to provide Americans with the economic security and economic opportunity to navigate a dynamic 21st century economy. We're here today to discuss two reports that New America commissioned on the so-called Millennial generation. For the purposes of today's events, just so everyone's clear, we're defining Millennials as one of two things, either born in 1982 or later, or for the purposes of Pierre Levine's paper, those whose first opportunity to vote occurred in the early 2000s or later. There's been a lot of talk in the wake of the presidential election as to the role that younger voters played in putting Barack Obama over the top. Certainly, we saw the margin of millennials who went for the Democrats rise sharply compared to previous elections, as Pierre Levine will discuss in his presentation. But there's a lot more to this generation than just the snapshot from the 2008 elections. In fact, when we first conceived of these reports, we did so because we felt that if we were going to design a new social contract that was attuned to the realities of the 21st century, it was important to understand how the people who would live under that contract conceived their world. As you'll hear, the authors have defined a very distinct millennial attitude, one that is sometimes hard to pin down. Surveys, voting trends, and more anecdotal evidence show this generation to be a number of things. They're confident but consensus-oriented. They're risk-averse and sheltered but drawn to lofty challenges. They're more liberal than any recent generation at their age, but also more family-oriented and with more trust in major corporations and government than any cohort. They are, as Neil Howe and Riemer Nadler write, poised to become a builder generation. In terms of the relevance of these traits to public policy making, the recently passed economic stimulus bill has a lot of millennial flavor to it. There's certainly, when you're spending $800 billion, of faith in the ability of government to drive progress. There's a focus on technology as a problem solver. And the bipartisanship that was held out, if not achieved, as key to the bill's passage resonates very strongly with the millennial passion for consensus. So already we are seeing the effects of this generation on politics and policy in America. As they become a plurality of the electorate sometime in the next decade, their influence will continue to grow. We've got a great group of panelists to discuss today's topics. First, we'll hear from Neil Howe and Riemer Nadler on their report, Yes We Can, The Emergence of Millennials as a Political Generation. Theirs is a big picture analysis of where millennials fit in the history of political generations. Neil Howe has been chronicling the effects of generational change for, dare I say, generations, including 6 books on the topic co-authored with the late William Strauss. His predictions on how previous generations would affect society and government have been remarkably accurate. He is the co-founder of Life Associates and a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and senior advisor to the Concord Coalition. His co-author is Riemer Nadler, a classically overachieving millennial who is the program director at Life Course Associates, where she's been a valuable contributor to the generational literature that they have produced. She's a graduate of Swarthmore College. Also with us is Pierre Levine, the director of the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, called CIRCLE, at Tufts University, along with Professor Connie Flanagan and Les Gillet they are the authors of The Millennial Pendulum, A New Generation of Voters, and the Prospects for a Political Realignment. And we have that other report here today. Peter and his team sorted through a number of longitudinal studies to sort out how millennials compare to other generations at their age and whether the liberal leanings they hold today are likely to continue as they get older. Peter has written several books on philosophy and politics, as well as an academic thriller novel entitled Something to Hide, which was described in one review as The Pelican Brief meets Shelley's Heart with a dash of Nietzsche and Leo Strauss. So, yes. After Neil and Riemer and Peter, we'll have a response on the reports from 2 people who have their fingers on the pulse of the millennials, as a professional observer and as a campaign organizer. Scott Keator is the director of survey research at the Pew Research Center. He's written extensively on politics, civic engagement, and young voters, although no novels yet, as far as I'm aware. He's taught at George Mason, Rutgers, and VCU, and he's served as an exit poll analyst for NBC News since 1980. Finally, we have Hans Riemer. Hans has been working with young voters for some time, first as political and issues director for Rock the Vote, and most recently as national youth director for the Obama campaign. He's also been active in various political and advocacy campaigns, including the opposition to Social Security privatization. So as you can see, we have a great group. They have a lot to report, and we're very glad to have you here. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Scott, and it's great to be here, and I'm glad that the allure of generations could overcome the bad weather. So it just shows that this is a topic of perennial interest. Let's get this there we go. We're going to do sort of a tag team here, so I'm going to do my half and sort of set the stage more broadly in thinking about millennials as a generation, which I think is important before you examine what it is politically. Examine just what it is as a generation. Then we're going to have Rena come in and talk more specifically about our findings about how it's behaving, how this generation is behaving in politics. We all talk about generations, but we rarely define what it is. So I thought I would just start by saying something about what is a generation and summarize maybe some of the high points of 2 centuries of thinking by generations theorists and social scientists. So our summary definition of a generation is a cohort group, a set of people born over a period of years, which is about the length of a span of a phase of life, about 20 years, a little more, a little less. And you identify these groups by looking at generations which share a common age, location, and history. They grow up, they share a certain era of history in childhood and a subsequent era of history coming of age into adulthood. They share a common attitude and behavior traits, which of course we can measure by all kinds of data that's collected by both private institutions and philanthropies and government. And finally, and this is very important to Karl Mannheim when he talked about generations, they share a common collective identity. You can go out and ask people, what generation do you think you belong to? What generation do you feel you belong to? This has always been an important part of belonging to a generation. A political generation is simply a social generation acting politically. Now that sounds obvious, but I raise it because people sometimes talk about 5-year political generations or 40-year political generations. Or they will think that a generation can simply be taught to behave politically by what their parents think politically. That never happens. A generation's political views rise out organically from what it is as an entire generation, socially, culturally, with attitudes toward family life and risk-taking and everything else. We have, in our writing, identified many generations over history, even going back before this. It's interesting that when we identify social generations, most people who talk about political generations, this would include the Schlesingers, this would include Danny Lazar, Morton Keller, Samuel Huntington. They all identify pretty much the same generations politically as being distinct. For instance, generations born coming of age during a war, those who were children during the war, and those who grew up after the war as an example of location and history. Let me just say a few words to set the stage for millennials about some of today's living generations. And I think each of these, we would agree, not only is a generation, but represents a distinct sort of collective political identity. The GI generation, sometimes called, most notably by Tom Brokaw, America's greatest generation, were Americans who came of age during the New Deal and the Great Depression. We all know who they are. When they were kids, they were called junior citizens, and as soon as they reached old age, we called them senior citizens, which became a new word we applied to old people. Before them, we just called old people, you know. The silent generation were the children of that era. They were the children of the Great Depression and war, and they came of age during the American High, the presidencies of Truman and Eisenhower and John Kennedy, and they came of age famously not wanting to change the system, but to work within the system. Fortune magazine had a famous cover story in 1949 called The College Class of 1949, and the subtitle was Taking No Chances. So they got this, they have a collective image as being technocrats, people who want to improve the system but not fundamentally change it. Interestingly, this generation has produced something like 12 or 13 chiefs of staff of the White House but not a single president. Okay, the first generation has been totally jumped over for the presidency. Boomers, of course, were the generation with no memory of the Great Depression and World War II. They came along afterwards. They were the children of the American high, and they came of age in that period of rapid social and cultural change we sometimes call the consciousness revolution. And this has shaped boomers ever afterwards as a generation of vision and values. They invented the counterculture, and today they lead the culture wars, right? Red zone and blue zone, and they're always telling other generations what's right and what's wrong and what's good and what's bad. And we've had obviously two boomer presidents, Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. Generation X, well, they have no memory of the American high. A good test of an Xer is, do you have a personal memory of John Kennedy's assassination? A boomer does, an Xer doesn't. And they came of age really, they were the children of the consciousness revolution, the little kids of Woodstock, which sort of explains their pragmatism and their cynicism about life, I think. And they came of age after that was over. It's interesting to me to reflect on these early 60s cohorts, how much they define Generation X. Michael Jordan, Michael Dell, Michael J. Fox, Doug Kuplin, who wrote the novel Generation X, was born in 1961, as was Barack Obama, who had very much a Gen X childhood, father not present, kind of broken family, moving around the world. And he is the first leader in American politics to explicitly identify himself as a post-boomer leader. He wants to put an end to everything dysfunctional about boomer politics. But finally, you have this new generation, Millennials. What's their location in history? Well, they have no memory of the consciousness revolution even as kids. They came along when all that was over. So Woodstock to them is as distant as the New Deal is to a boomer like myself. That's their location. It's a question, for their SOLs. Like, what did we do at Woodstock? But there's no personal experience. And that's their location in history. And that has had huge implications for how they are different. They're different from Gen Xers, just as Xers are different from boomers. And what I want to do now is talk a little bit about that, reflect here about how each of these generations represents. GI is a generation of rising trust in politics. Silent, a generation who hugely trusted the system. Boomers, a generation of declining trust. Gen X, a generation notoriously of little trust. The lowest voter participation rates in every age group they've been through. And also the lowest share of congressmen and state governors of any generation in American history at their current age. The Gen Xers just don't participate. Their idea of life is just stay off the public radar screen. Maybe I'll be safe that way. But millennials are coming along and filling that vacuum. Now, what I want to do now is just say a few things about some collective traits of millennials, and then I'm going to hand it over to Rena to say a little bit more specifically about their politics. Well, who are millennials and what are their distinguishing characteristics? Well, first of all, they're special, right? They're special in the eyes of community, politicians, the media, and especially special in the eyes of their parents, right? These are VIPs. They came along with baby on board stickers and those little minivans and all those ways of buckling them into their seats. They came along with all those cuddly baby movies. Remember 3 Minute a Baby and all that? After all those Child is Devil movies that Gen Xers had when they were young. But all of this represented a huge shift. Fathers present at the birth of children. 65% by the late 1980s, thanks to the Lamaze movement. Only 20% even at the end of the 1970s. Today, by the way, it's around 80% fathers present at the birth of their kids. And we have so many images of specialness in the media, how well they're treated. We sell products now by showing kids in the advertisements. Here's another example of specialness. This is a baby boomlet or echo boom generation. We wanted to have kids again. Fertility rates have risen for every age of woman during the millennial era. You can see what Generation Xers, we didn't want to have kids back then. That's why they're called the baby bust generation. Parents now agree that they spend more time with their children than their own parents spent with them at the same age. Despite the fact that they're working more, they spend more time with their kids. This would not have been true. This would have been reversed had you taken this poll 25 or 30 years ago. What's another attribute of millennials? Well, they're sheltered, right? A wall of sheltering goes up every year. All those little gadgets you buy, those things you put on your plugs and your stoves and your cupboards, that became a multi-billion-dollar industry in the 1980s when they were kids. And all the worries we have, the bicycle helmets and the special materials and playgrounds. The millennials have been the object of one of the great child protection movements in American history. We have had several of them. We had one, for instance, during the Progressive era in the early 20th century. We've had one now over the past 15 years. All of these rules, even laws named after millennial victims like Megan laws or Code Adam, you know, someone's lost in a Walmart, bam, all the doors shut. No one can get out until that one child is found. Well, we sell products now by talking about kids' safety. No one ever did that when Gen Xers were you know, when Gen Xers were kids, child restraint was telling them to put up their arms when the car was about to hit them. Or for Gen X parents with little kids, the protection is just totally over the top. So, but we've become accustomed to that. What's another aspect of millennials? They're risk averse. Every measure, take a look at how crime has gone down. This is the most dramatic reduction of youth crime in American history. There's certainly since we've measured it. This is the Department of Education showing some of the trends. The same things are true from the victimization surveys. Take a look at teen pregnancy. I mean, it's down. It showed a little uptick recently, but it's down 35 to 40%, both teen pregnancy and teen abortion. But it's not just pregnancy and crime and big things. It's little things. Risk aversion across the board. And those of you who are interested in this, CDC keeps a list of about 50 youth risk surveillance indicators. Most of those are down since the early 90s. Those that aren't down are unchanged. Only one is up, obesity, okay, which could plausibly be attributed to an excess of overprotection. What's another trait? They're conventional. They have conventional life goals. You ask millennials what they want to do. They want to have balanced careers. They want to be good neighbors. They want to be good citizens. A record share wants to, you know, get married and have kids, according to the UCLA freshman poll. You ask them how they like to spend their time. They say, with my family, right? And in fact, this generation gets along better with their parents than any generation we've measured, any generation of teenagers, vastly better than boomers back in the mid and early 1970s. They ask each other for advice. They listen to the same music on their iPods. I mean, it's almost unrecognizable, the disappearance of the culture gap. We see evidence. Harry Potter, you think of a structured environment, right? Quizzes and exams and little group projects, and it's all very structured. They all know what their career is going to be. They're all going to be wizards. They don't have to figure that out. And it's all divided up into little career academies, right? And if you want conventional, just take a look at the popularity of High School Musical. And every Xer has assigned this. They have to watch this. I just advise them to take a dose of insulin first. Because what's another trait? Confident and trusting. They trust institutions more than Xers, more than boomers. And an interesting finding that came out in the New York Times in the late 1990s. They want to do good things. You know, we see an increasing amount of images now targeting young people about being confident and doing good things for the country. This is a generation that is team-oriented, team teaching, team grading being taught, citizenship being taught in their K-12 classrooms. And we see so much evidence of this, of the teamwork. This is how retailers are targeting this generation now. Look at how they're changing technology away from the individuation that Steve Jobs and Bill Gates brought us with the personal computer, getting away from the mainframe. And then Xers with the net and web commerce. Boomers are moving technology back to the community. No one predicted that. It's not the people who invented technology told millennials to do that. They decided to do that. And that's why the huge popularity of Facebook and MySpace and Twittering and the GPS chips on their cell phones and all that. And they're active in the community. And, you know, record rates of volunteering for this generation. We see, as was mentioned, a huge increase. By the way, these data are from Circle. So, you know, just we all share each other's findings here. But these are incredible numbers about the re-engagement of young people in politics as millennials have entered this phase of life. This I thought was a fascinating little chart. It shows the college senior list of ideal employers in 2010 when you had late wave Gen Xers graduating from college. And look at the difference in 2007. In 2001, the favorite employers for college seniors were all for-profit corporations. In 2007, 5 of the top 10 were either government agencies or nonprofits. And finally, this is a high-achieving generation. They love meeting and exceeding objective benchmarks of their success. They don't want to drop out of the system. They want to engage the system and succeed within the system. We see, for instance, many measures of this. I'm just going to show a couple here. Huge increase, for instance, in the nationally standardized advanced placement exam, particularly among minorities in this generation. This is my favorite, and I'll just close with this. This is a spelling bee, which in the millennial era has become this huge media event. It's on ESPN, it's on ABC. Everyone wants to know how well these kids can spell. And it's very millennial. It's a very structured activity, and you've got parents and counselors and everyone helping them. And it's structured. You know, you got to learn so many words. Well, you might wonder, how well can they spell, right? How well do they do? Well, here's some examples of winning words in the 1950s, 1970s, and 1990s. I will now give you the last 8 years of winning words. And you can make the comparison yourself, right? Anyway, this is an amazing generation, capable of amazing things. And in politics, I'm going to turn this over to Riemer. There you go. With that, I'll turn it over.
Well, Neil, as a millennial myself, I'd like to thank you for that slide. It's very flattering. So Neil spoke about the background of who the millennial generation is, and I'm going to speak a little bit more about who they are as a political generation. And every new generation comes along with a new set of political priorities. They really differ from prior generations in their political views. But what we found is that those differences tend not to fit neatly into the political categories defined by older generations, which, you know, if you think about it, does make sense. So this is the case with the millennial generation as well. Give me 1 second. There we go. Is that better? See, I'm supposed to be good at technology with my generation. I don't know what's wrong. So millennials come along with a new set of political views. And just like other generations, these views tend not to fit neatly into the liberal conservative categories that older generations usually think of when we're defining political views. Now, if we just think about conventional political identification, self-identification, millennials represent truly a dramatic shift towards the Democratic Party, and also are more likely to identify themselves as middle of the road, less likely to identify themselves as middle of the road politically, more likely to identify themselves as more liberal, and also somewhat more likely to identify themselves as more conservative compared to Gen Xers. But these trends truly don't tell the whole story about millennials. And when we look very carefully and in more detail at their political views, it becomes clear that they do cut across partisan divides in ways that often are baffling to older generations. Overall, we might say that millennials tend to be fiscally liberal and socially conservative, but with whole new twists of their own. And so I'm going to get into that and talk about, we've divided millennials' sort of long-term political agenda into 10 sort of thematic imperatives. And I'm going to go through them, and as I go through them, I'll mention briefly how older generations might see them in terms of the liberal and conservative agenda. So the first one is strengthen the community. As Neil discussed a moment ago, millennials are very interested in building strong community ties in their own groups of friends and in the national politics and community service in all of these ways. And like older liberals, millennials believe that community needs come before individual needs. They want government to focus on building a strong community, reversing income and wealth inequality. Millennials agree very strongly, you can see here, that government should promote the principle of strong communities and policies to expand and promote prosperity to all, as opposed to that government should promote a principle of self-reliance and policies of limited government and low taxes. Older Gen Xers are just about split on this question, but millennials feel fairly strongly that the role of government should be to promote strong community. On the other hand, like older conservatives, millennials tend to believe that personal liberties are are not as important as the community needs either. Surveys show that teens are the most likely to object to restrictions on government monitoring of citizens to prevent terrorism. So personal right to privacy is not at the top of their agenda. You know, many of them are putting up all that information about their lives on YouTube and Facebook voluntarily. They really are much more oriented around the needs of the community than on those individual rights. And they also tend to believe that the middle class is very important. They want to strengthen it culturally, strengthen it economically, tend to be pro tax policies that lower income inequalities, but not pro policies that pit different classes against each other. And this is a key difference from boomers. If you look at boomers in the late 1970s, they were much more likely than millennials are to say that we should tax and penalize the wealthy. So this is a generation that cares a lot about class differences but approaches it very differently from the way older liberals might think about it. The next theme is to trust the system. And Neil touched on this as well. Millennials really like structure and order in their lives, and they turn to institutions to get that order. They've been doing it their whole lives with parents, with schools, now with their employers, and they're doing it also with the government. Like older liberals, they believe that government should help individuals make decisions, offer regulation and expert advice that can help people make the decisions they need to make. If you look, you can see in 2004, young people are the ones who are most likely to say that health insurance should come from a government plan rather than a private plan. Back in 1978, when boomers were the youth generation being surveyed, it was older people who were more likely to say that. So this generation really is pro government and expert regulation to solve any number of national problems. And like older conservatives, they're drawn to this new paternalism, where the government offers benevolent help to help individuals get their lives back on track, especially people who are having a particular amount of trouble. In 2007, 1 in 3 of 18 to 29-year-olds agreed completely that it's the responsibility of government to take care of people who can't take care of themselves. That's up hugely from 1994. And this could mean any number of things, from offering new facilities for homeless people and the mentally ill to mandatory rehabilitation for criminals. And then there's minimized personal risk. Neil also touched on how risk-averse millennials are. And the key millennial trait about this is that millennials are very accepting of all of the protections that they've been given as children and as young adults. Parents have really showered all of these protections on them, and instead of rebelling, they have accepted them as one more sign that they're a special generation, even come to expect them even when they're over the top. I don't know if maybe you boomers can tell me what you think your peers would have done had your parents tried to impose any of these safety precautions on you as a teenager. You would have rebelled, I would imagine. But millennials don't rebel. They have really come to expect protection, and they will expect it from government as well as from their parents, especially given their rising trust in government institutions. But like older conservatives, they have very little tolerance for violence, crime, and disorder in their lives. When asked which issues concern them most, millennials mention personal safety, crime, violence, terrorism, the war in Iraq. So it's no surprise that they favor policies that encourage tough responses to crime and encourage risk-free lifestyles. Another theme is support the family. Neil mentioned how close millennials are with their parents. That's one of the most enduring trends of this generation. And they are really bringing a renewed focus on the importance of family life. And like older liberals, they support a very broad definition of what a family can look like. Divorced parents, older siblings raising younger siblings, 2 moms, 2 dads. Anyone who's been watching movies and television for the last 10 years can see this new acceptance reflected in the popular culture. And millennials are nearly twice as likely, in fact, as older Americans to favor gay marriage, and are the only age group that favors allowing gays to adopt children. But there's also, again, the liberal-conservative split here, because like older conservatives, millennials really focus on family life and family values as one of the building blocks of a stable, successful American society. We see not only that they're keeping very close emotional and financial contact with their parents as they get older, but they're showing renewed interest in starting their own new families earlier. The UCLA College Freshman Survey found that raising a family has been rising as one of the most important values that freshmen have. And actually, last year, for the first time, the median age of having a first child went down for the first time since that statistic has been measured since the late 1970s. That may be, indicative of the new generation of millennial parents and a shift that we might see among them. Be upbeat and optimistic. Here we get the yes we can message that our paper is named for. And millennials truly are attracted to politicians who exude that kind of yes we can optimism. They tend to be much more confident than older generations about the direction of the country and where the country is going, and also more willing to take on big projects. Like older liberals, they believe that government can be a force for good in aggressive ways in domestic policies. A decreasing share of youth say that government should only get involved in initiatives at a local level. They believe that federal government can truly make a big difference with big domestic policies, and they are thinking big. And like older conservatives, they believe America is a force for good in global affairs, and particularly that technology should be harnessed to solve a lot of the nation's most pressing problems. Whatever young people might think about the wisdom of originally going into Iraq, they are far more likely than any older generation to say that the eventual outcome is likely to be good. When they think about American foreign policy, they tend to be positive before they're pessimistic, which is very, very different from older generations. Make capitalism work better. Millennials are causing all kinds of confusion with their vision of the economy. They tend to be pro-regulation without being anti-market or anti-business. So like older liberals, they believe that government regulation is key to having a workable and equitable economy. The survey of 3 generations of youth about whether government should ensure everyone has a good job and standard of living. Millennials agree fairly strongly. Boomers disagreed, and Xers were fairly split on this question. But millennials are also pro-business, pro-markets, and believe that markets are truly the best way to organize a complex globalizing economy. The share who agree that the strength of this country today is mostly based on the success of American business is highest for millennials. And again, this touches back on the optimism. Millennials have the optimism to believe that the right combination of policies can regulate the economy so that it's both fair and works beautifully through markets. I mean, it's sort of this idea that we really can have everything. And so their policy ideas are crossing the usual divide between free market principles and regulation. Even in education, for example, they tend to be pro-federal funding for education, but they are also pro-vouchers and school choice. Champion unity over diversity. Millennials are very drawn to the idea of a community that is less focused on identity politics than boomers have been, whether gender, race, ethnicity, sexuality. They do take for granted a diverse range of cultures and backgrounds. From the late 1980s to today, I found this very striking. The share of 25-year-olds who completely agree that it's all right for blacks and whites to date each other has more than tripled, from 20% to 64%. Gen Xers in the 1980s were also twice as likely as millennials to say that, Xers were twice as likely to agree that they have nothing in common with people of other races. But like older conservatives, millennials don't want to focus hugely on the differences. They want to focus on what brings everybody together into a melting pot, into an American mainstream. Roughly half of college undergraduates in recent years say affirmative action should be abolished as a factor in college admissions. And more qualitatively, with the sort of emerging divide between older minority leaders like Jesse Jackson Sr. and Al Sharpton, and then there's Jesse Jackson Jr. and Barack Obama, who are much less divisive, much more community-oriented. We see millennials resonating far more with the younger Gen X leaders than with that more divisive racial message. Favor realistic multilateral world leadership. Millennials are shying away from ideology on both sides of the aisle on this question. They don't think that America should go in and remake whole regions of the rest of the world in our image. And they also are not ideologically opposed to America using force in the world. They really are moving back towards a sense of realism. What works best to keep America strong and safe? And like older liberals, they tend to say that diplomacy and multilateralism is the best way to do this. Millennials are far more likely than the population as a whole to agree that America's security depends on building strong ties with other nations as opposed to its own military strength. Pew recently found that millennials are the age group that's least likely to believe that peace can be achieved through military action. But unlike many older liberals, millennials are not ideologically opposed to the military. They actually are very favorable in their opinions of the military. The share who have a very good opinion of the military has been going up. It's reached a fairly high number. And it's also coming with a new surge of a feeling of patriotism. Millennials ranked their own patriotism 7.2 on a scale of 0 to 10, higher than any other trait except their own health. Seek consensus and decorum in politics is another theme. Millennials are clearly pushing this bipartisanship, the idea that everyone should really get along, everyone should treat each other better. Boomers were children during the 1950s at a time when there was a very broad feeling of national consensus. Millennials have been growing up at a time when, negative ads and character assaults and, this kind of negative partisan politics has been the status quo. And they really want to bring more of an air of decorum and friendliness to politics. Like older liberals, they prefer a broad sweeping consensus on policy issues. Millennials tend to prefer a broad sweeping consensus on most issues. College professors have been complaining that in their classes, students don't want to passionately discuss the issues the professors care about. They just want to get together, come up with a consensus, and give the right answer. It's driving the boomer professors crazy. And in politics as well, millennials truly prefer a broad consensus around which everyone can rally. Millennials are the ones who most strongly agree. I like political leaders who are willing to make compromises in order to get the job done. And like older conservatives, they seek a new ethic of decorum in politics. Barack Obama actually embodied this very well in something he said after the election. He said, "I think we can disagree without being disagreeable." That's this sort of very new millennial tone that people shouldn't be disagreeable, they should be polite and treat each other well even when arguing over politics. 74% of 18 to 24-year-olds agree that politics has become too partisan, and they want to bring this new air of credentialed decorum to politics. And this is well embodied by the motto of the Youth Entitlement Summit, which is a youth advocacy group, and their motto is governance, not politics, which I think really well embodies the millennial view. And finally, plan ahead for the long term. Millennials have really been thinking farther ahead than prior generations did at the same age, both about their own lives and about the direction of the country. And like older liberals, they really want to plan major public priorities into the budget for the long term. They want them to be planned functions of government. Nearly 9 in 10 of today's teens agree that world leaders should do whatever it takes to tackle climate change. Youth really want policymakers to step in and make the difference and solve the problems, the big problems that have been facing America for years, so that in the long term for themselves as adults and even for their children and grandchildren, these problems will be solved. But at the same time, they are worried about the financial consequences of overspending. They want to protect the living standards of themselves at a later age and of their own children. So they want government to do all of this while still being fiscally responsible. And one of the ways that they think to do this is to aggressively make aggressive changes to programs that are unsustainable. So the percentage of respondents who want to reduce the rate of Social Security benefit growth is by far the highest for the 18 to 29-year-old age bracket. Unlike boomers at the same age, and Xers, they're thinking ahead. Millennials are thinking about what's going to happen to them when they're at retirement age. You know, they walk into a job and immediately open their 401k plan. They want government to make sure to offer them, you know, their part of that 401k plan. And that is all the themes. I guess just to end, it's really clear looking at these themes that millennials have a very different set of public priorities from boomers or Xers at the same age. And this is not something that politicians are going to be able to ignore, particularly because of millennials' new political engagement. I mean, they're voting in higher numbers, they're turning out to organize, they're making their opinions heard. And if they follow the trajectory that we believe they will follow based on their prior life history, they're really going to become a political powerhouse that is going to really shake up the political system and truly forge a new social contract and even strengthen the connections between citizens and government institutions in a major way. Neil?
That's good. Now, we'll hear from Pierre Levine on his paper.
It's on. Great. Thank you. That was terrific. I always get a kick out of this kind of discussion because I'm an Xer and we look pretty bad, and we probably deserve it. I personally am not that cynical, but my classmates certainly are. So here's our title, for which I thank Frank. We served up a typically boring academic title, something, you know, prospects for blah, 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 and he gave us a nice main title and also funded the paper, so thanks to the New America Foundation for that. And I'd like to thank my two colleagues, Connie Flanagan and Les Scalay from Penn State, who, you know, I'm the talking head there in Penn State, but they did a lot of the work. I'm actually just going to show you some graphs out of the report. And the one that's driving the interest in our topic today is really this one. This may not be able to read it too clearly, but I'll give you the information you need. This just shows the fact that over the last 30 years, young people have typically voted for the same, young voters have typically voted for the same candidate that older voters have voted for. So the gap between the under 30s and everybody else has been really small. The graph on the left is Democrats, the vote for the Democratic candidate. The graph on the right is the vote for the Republican candidate. And the dark line shows under 30s, and the lighter line shows everybody else. And what you see is that those lines were just tracking each other closely until in 2004 a gap opened, and then in 2008 it really blew open. So the 66% support for Barack Obama by young people was completely unprecedented. And it raises very interesting questions for the political class about whether this is something lasting and what it means. I think those, and of course this is combined with the numbers that Neil showed, that turnout is also up. So you have an active group and a group voting for the Democratic candidate. I think this was, these graphs were sort of predicted by a number of people, probably by you guys, and I think Hans may or may not have predicted it, but was certainly hoping for it. Maybe caused it. Well, he can talk about that later. I just wanted to put in a quick plug for the book Millennial Makeover by Winograd and Heiss from last year, which also kind of predicts this. But the question that we wanted to tackle, and in a way our paper is much narrower and is really on one topic, is what can we predict based on this? I mean, is this a one-time thing, a short-term thing, or does it portend a change? And obviously we don't have a crystal ball, but we have a little relevant evidence. So the complication is that when we go through life as I'm going to talk about smaller groups and generations. So when we go through life as a cohort, you know, three things happen to us, and it's very hard to sort them out. One is that we go through history with everybody else who's older than us and younger than us, and we have the same reactions, more or less, to what happens. So if you look at the graph on the right, that's conservative self-identity, saying I'm a conservative. And along the x-axis, the bottom there, is simply the date. So as we go through history from 1972 to 2004, all the different generations, shown in different lines there, have sort of the same bouncing up and down reaction. They all get more conservative, for example, as the Gingrich Revolution comes along. So by 1994, they're much more conservative than they were in the 80s. And if you looked at other kinds of questions, for example, everybody changed their attitudes towards civil liberties in a more, I guess, conservative direction immediately after 9/11. So things happen to everybody, and they all react the same way. The second thing that happens is that, generally speaking, at least looking over these past generations, people get more conservative as they get older. Not dramatically, and maybe it's not written in stone, but it's happened in the past. So, Winston Churchill said, if a man is not liberal when he's young, he has no heart. If he's not conservative when he's old, he has no brain. There's a strong value judgment in there, which I'm not necessarily endorsing, but there's also a developmental theory that we get more conservative. And the graph on the left actually shows the same generations and the same data, but just arrayed in a different way, so that now those are ages along the bottom. So we're sort of moving the lines so that they show ages. And what you can see is that each of those, the boomers and the Gen Xers follow the same trajectory. They get more conservative with age. The greatest generation group there, that's the dark line, is they only enter the picture when they're 41 or so, 40 probably. So we can't really see what happened in youth, but I strongly suspect they also had gotten more conservative by the time they reached that age. So that's the second thing that happens, and it's hard sometimes to sort those two things out. But a third thing is also happening, which is that each generation has got its own special profile, which it keeps to a degree, and this is the point that you guys were making strongly. So if you look at the boomers versus Gen Xers, what's happening there is partly that they're both following the same trajectory, and partly from the right-hand graph that they're both bouncing around in response to the same events, but partly that the Gen Xers at the same age are always more conservative by a substantial chunk than the boomers. So their arrival on my generation's arrival on the national stage moved the country a few notches to the right. And the only thing that would change that would be the arrival of a new generation that would move the country to the left. So one way to summarize this, and it's really perhaps our main finding, is that your starting place, even though you bounce around a whole lot, and even though you get more conservative, your starting place seems to matter, which is interesting because the starting place for this generation is much to the left, at least in terms of Democrat versus Republican preference in this last couple of elections. I'm going to go through my other slides quite quickly, so let me dwell on this a bit more. It's also, I just find it interesting how subtle this is in a way and how hard it is to see, because when people just a little older than me able to vote for Reagan or Dukakis, in other words, the young voters at that time, they were actually more liberal than everybody else at that time because they were young. So they actually, Dukakis did relatively well among that group. They looked, if you just did a sort of cross-sectional surveys at that moment, they would be the most liberal. But importantly, they were less liberal than the previous generations had been at the same point. And so as their sort of initial formative experience played out over their life, they moved the country to the right. So you can't always tell what's going on unless you are careful. Now, I'm going to show you some more slides. The graph 7 on the left there is just the liberal identity question instead of the conservative identity question, but the reason I pulled it out of the report to show it to you was because of that little number up there at the top right, which is a few data points for the millennials in the last 2 elections. And look how much more liberal they are than anybody's been for, this is just 20 years. But it's so if the traditional line continues, that line will slope down. Of course, again, we don't have a crystal ball and anything could happen, but if the traditions continue, that line will slope down, but starting dramatically higher than where it's been for liberal self-identity. So now let me break this down into some specific survey questions which help to flesh out what's motivating their identities. Because all I've said so far is that they voted for Barack Obama and also for John Kerry, and that they call themselves liberals at a higher rate. But that doesn't tell us what they believe. So I think one sort of explanatory factor here is their attitude towards government waste. And this is very consistent with what you said about the sort of generally positive attitude towards institutions. If you assume that one of the things that separates a conservative from a liberal is a kind of gut feeling about how much government waste there is, you see is that generally speaking, and it's a little more complicated because it's affected by changes in the world, but generally speaking, people get less tolerant or more concerned about government waste as they get older, presumably paying taxes and having more experience with particular examples of government waste. But young people are starting a whole lot less concerned about it than we've seen for a long time. And that's probably part of what's going on. Actually, graph 8 is the same graph, and I made a mistake and pasted it over twice, so sorry about that. Graph 9, though, I think is a little more interesting, or a little more complicated, because this is society should do anything necessary to guarantee equality of opportunity. And actually, I left this in here for discussion. I don't know exactly how to explain it, but what you do see is that the millennials are less supportive of that than other generations right now, and starting less supportive than previous generations have been. So they are less likely to say that society should do anything necessary to guarantee equality of opportunity. And if anybody has any insight into that, I'd love to hear it. And then this question of confidence in institutions. They are more confident, and actually we have in the report all the questions we could find on different institutions. So we have the executive branch and financial institutions, and et cetera. Just pulled a few out. Unions, much more confident, and Congress, more confident. Now, the zigzag, by the way, that uptick in 2004, I think we should ignore for now, because that's just one election, and it could well be, and the sample is reasonable enough to show it in a graph, but not huge, and I can imagine that they just got a few particularly genial millennials in that 2004 sample. So I think we wait a little while before we kind of think of an average. But even if you average it 3 years, and those would be entirely different samples. It's not a longitudinal study. They're way up from anybody else in terms of their confidence in unions and in Congress. One of the things that's kind of interesting about Congress is that for everybody else, the confidence in the executive branch soared after 9/11 and then fell back down as the Iraq War came. But for everybody else, there was no transfer over to Congress, which continued to have low confidence rate. But the millennials seem to be quite confident in Congress in that period. Now, this is my last slide, but I want to, I guess, dwell on it just a bit too, because actually the graph on the left is some of the same data that Neil showed. But I want to end with something that we didn't talk about in the paper, because it wasn't the subject of the paper, and that's fine. But it's, I think, very, very relevant, and it dominates the work that Circle does. And that is not to look at millennials, sort of average millennial versus the average Xer versus the average boomer, et cetera, but to think about differences within the millennials. Because you can easily forget about that if you show true information about the millennials versus other generations. But it will lull you into forgetting differences. In fact, the differences among millennials are very profound. And there are differences by race and ethnicity. After all, this generation is attending more segregated schools than my generation was. There are differences by region, by ideology, but we focus mostly, because of a thought process we've gone through about why this is important, and differences by educational attainment. And the differences are profound. The college attendance rate has not actually budged up in the last 25 years. And one way to show it is sort of a lot of different angles on who's going to college. But that graph on the right is not in the report, but I plunked it in sort of on short notice yesterday because I thought it was important. It shows the proportion, it shows age at the bottom, 18, 19, 20, 21. This is for very recent years. So at age 18, just over 30% of people are in college. At age 19, because that's a little higher, at age 20 it peaks at about 40%. So about 40% of the population's in college. And then the blue part is those who finished high school by then, but haven't gone to college. But about a third of the young population is not completing high school. Some of them pick it up later, and so by the time the dust all settles, they do finish high school. But never more than about less than 40% are in college. And the proportion who are in college at that time, many of them, I think actually most of them, do not complete a four-year college. So the proportion that's completing a four-year college is more like a quarter. And the reason I bring this up is because if you compare the college and the non-college, there are vast chasms in almost everything. I mean, one example is the trends in community service over on the left. That's the community service rate. So we know millennials involved in community service, it's true if we average them. But the lines show the difference between those who think they're going to go to four-year college, is the black line, and those who think they're going to go to two-year or no college, which is the lines below. There's a huge gap. There'd be a much bigger gap with voting. In the primaries, the gap was about fourfold between the college and the non-college primary electoral turnout. There are huge differences in attitudes and Certainly optimism, tech savvy, all these things are hugely different. A lot of this was underlined for us when we did focus groups in a major urban American city, a poor American city prior to the election, just a few weeks before the election. And none of the 60 or so youth in those focus groups, I believe none, had any interest at all in voting. Very few of them saw any possible relevance about the election to their lives, and none of them had anything positive to say. For example, about volunteer service, which they almost all, or most typically equated with court-ordered punishment. So, and it's strikingly different from a college student sample where they'll think of service in terms of, my future service in the U.S. Congress is a possibility. So the differences are profound. Now, what does it mean? I mean, from a political prognostication point of view, if you were harsh about it, you could say the non-college aren't going to vote. They're not going to run for Congress. They're not going to give money. They're not going to become pundits. It's exactly the college students who fit the measures of sort of having been protected when they were young, being optimistic, being genial about institutions, who are going to dominate. And I think that's absolutely true. But if we're thinking of a social policy concern and we're actually not sort of trying to tap the energies of the millennials, but rather trying to make sure that they get a fair deal, we have to remember that just about half of them aren't, I think, described by these statistics that we've been showing at all. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. We're going to just ask our two other contributors to come up. We'll hear from Hans Riemer and Scott Keator. So, as you've read and heard, very interesting, very comprehensive analysis of this new generation, and we have two experts, one in the area of polling and one in the area of organizing and mobilizing millennials, to comment on the report, and then following that we'll ask our authors back up and we can take questions from you. So, please.
Great, thank you very much. Well, it's very, very nice to be here and have the opportunity to read and comment on these two really excellent papers. I think you only got a small slice of what's contained within them. Peter indicated that he was just giving you a brief overview, and that certainly was true. There's a lot of data in there. There's a lot of very good analysis. The report from Neil and his colleagues is even larger and more complicated. He did bring a lot of the theory out and describe some of the data, but there's a lot more in the paper. So I think both of these are well worth picking up and reading. They're really quite interesting. I'm not viewing my role here as a critic in particular. I think there are some interesting issues raised in the papers that I can comment on, but should I stand up? Yeah. Okay. I think there are some interesting issues raised in the papers, and I might make a couple of comments about things that I'm skeptical about, but for the most part, I'd just like to highlight 4 or 5 points that I think are interesting and worthy of further thinking, or at least a few things that I think ought to be emphasized. And the first one is about just how strong this political trend is among the millennial generation. We look at it at the Pew Research Center from the point of view of things like party affiliation, which, as you know, is not an immutable thing. People do change their party affiliation from the results of things that are going on in the world and so forth. But what you start out with in terms of your affiliation is a pretty good predictor of what you're going to be 20 or 40 years later. And we can see this in looking at data from people like baby boomers of my generation who were pretty democratic oriented in our early adulthood and who remain distinctively so. If I had the graph up, I could show you a sort of bulge that's associated with people in their, say, 50s and early 60s. There's a distinct Democratic-leaning bulge there. By the same token, Gen X, which is more Republican-leaning, if you look at that same graphic, you find the Democratic and Republican lines close together. If I showed you that graph, it would be a very dramatic thing because the Democratic advantage in party affiliation among young people is about the same as the Democratic advantage in the presidential vote in this election, which, as you know, was about 2-to-1 in favor of Barack Obama. In our polling last year, averaging it all together, we found that 61% of millennials identified with the Democratic Party or leaned Democratic. And that was actually up quite a bit from only 4 years earlier. Young people are not as moored in their party affiliations, and they're more reactive to the events and to the zeitgeist, if you will. And they have reacted very dramatically in the Democratic direction. Indeed, one can look at who was president when an individual came of age politically and think about whether that president was popular or not at that time, and make a pretty good guess as to what that person's party affiliation is going to be. It works very well, spookily so, looking back over the last 50 or 60 years of history. There are lots of other ways to demonstrate the liberal or left-leaning qualities of the millennials. An interesting one that helps us to get away from sort of the slice of public opinion at this particular time is to look at the UCLA freshman survey, which is a very large survey of freshmen entering college. Now, this is a particular slice of the millennial generation, as Peter very wisely pointed out at the end of his remarks. But it does tend to track the influences of the zeitgeist, if you will, on young people. And what we're seeing in the most recent freshman survey, a survey that's been going on for about 40 years, is that 2/3 of millennials support gay marriage, which is up from only 52% just 10 years ago. Support for increased military spending is down to 28% from 45% just 6 years ago. And as Peter showed in his slides there, the percent identifying as liberal is now at a very high point, in fact, the highest point in the freshman survey since 1975. Lest the generalizations about left-leaning political attitudes wash over everything, I think it is important to keep in mind that there are some exceptions that may be very important looking forward and thinking about the social contract. One of them is the fact that President Bush found his strongest support in terms of an age group for his efforts to establish personal or private accounts in Social Security from the millennials. We documented that in our polling in 2005 and 2006. Similarly, social issues relating to things like gay marriage or immigration and so forth do show a very liberal trend among young people, but abortion, which is a very critical issue, does not show such a trend. In fact, there's almost no relationship between age and attitudes about abortion. There hasn't been for 20 years, and there's no obvious trend going on. So whatever this liberalizing trend is that is showing up in lots of other questions, it's not showing up on a very important signature issue. One of the things that may be driving some of these attitudes are demographic changes, which Neil and his colleagues talk about in their paper, and so do Peter. But this demographic, this group is a much more diverse demographic group than its predecessors. The number of blacks and Latinos within, let's say, voters on Election Day in 2008 was substantially above what it had been even 8 years ago. Some of that's demographic change, some of that is mobilization, but it also has implications for the attitudes that they have. Another change that we're seeing that we've been able to document over 20 years of polling at Pew is the growth in the percentage of young people who describe themselves as secular, either have no religion, who say that they are atheist or agnostic. Indeed, in our polling, looking again, averaging all of our polling last year, millennials, 24% of them are classified in our surveys as secular. That's compared with 16% for the national average and just 14% among boomers. We've also done a cohort analysis of the sort that Peter and his colleagues show in their paper on the religion question, and we can demonstrate pretty conclusively that what you start out at is where your age group is going to be as it get older. You're not necessarily going to become more religious as you get older. Some of you will lose your religion, but the net effect is that this cohort is probably going to continue with about a quarter of it saying that it is not religious. That obviously has political implications given the way our politics has been organized. I want to turn quickly to questions about political engagement, because they are very interesting. We saw in 2004 the biggest jump in voter turnout occurred among young people. In fact, most of the increase in voter turnout nationally between 2000 and 2004 was because of young people turning out at a higher rate. They were engaged and energized in that election. And they were engaged and energized in 2006 and again in 2008. We don't have final data from the census, so we can't say exactly what the turnout rate was, but all the indications are that turnout was up among young people. But, and as I suspect Hans will say a little more about it momentarily, it's not just because it's something that welled up out of this great group of goody two-shoes in the millennial generation. Part of it is because the system has adjusted to the idea of asking young people to get engaged. Both parties put into place much more sophisticated efforts to target and do outreach to young people, though the Democrats far outshone the Republicans this year in that respect. The exit poll data are very interesting in terms of this question. Overall, a quarter of young people reported being contacted by the Obama campaign, only 13% by the McCain campaign. But in some of the battleground states where the votes really mattered, the numbers are very striking. Among the millennials, 54% said they had been contacted by the Obama campaign in Pennsylvania, 46% in North Carolina, 45% in Indiana and Iowa, 44% in Virginia, and 43% in Ohio, all very important states for the Obama victory. And numbers, while we don't have comparisons from 4 years ago, are probably dramatically different from what they had been 4 years ago. I want to leave you with just a couple of other comments on things that I think are intriguing ideas and would love to see more research on. One of them is the fact that we continue to have this very anomalous finding in a long-standing series of survey questions that have been asked about interpersonal trust. The questions go something along the lines of, generally speaking, would you say that most people can be trusted, or you can't be too careful in life? Another one is, do you think people take advantage of you if they can, or they try to be helpful? We have seen steadily over the past 20 or 30 years a decline in interpersonal trust, with every new generation coming in less likely to say that they trust other people. The millennials are not an exception to that. I wonder exactly how we square that with the kinds of data that especially Neil and his colleagues have shown. Maybe it means that these questions just don't mean anything. They're bad survey questions, but they're very dramatic. People come in with a level of interpersonal trust that's lower than the previous generation, and they stay with that level over time. One thing that's not addressed in much detail in either of these papers, and I think is a fruitful area to look for, is technology. I think if you look for one thing that distinguished this generation from those that came before, it's the fact that it was born and raised with technology in a way that the rest of us really were not. It shows up in some obvious ways: facility with technology, the ability to use the tools. But it raises a question of facility to what ends. It seems to me that the most important one that we've seen from a political point of view as well as a social is the social networking abilities. The fact that people can take the technology and use it to self-organize towards certain ends. This was certainly the legacy of the Howard Dean campaign, although it wasn't necessarily young people taking advantage of the meetups then, but it was embraced in this election cycle by young people in a dramatic way. And then a point was alluded to that the fact that the technology makes sort of self-presentation and self-display a lot easier those of us in my age group at least shake our heads over the things that you see on social networking sites and you think, don't these people know they're going to be applying for jobs one day? Finally, I was intrigued by one idea that I'd love to hear more about, and that is something in Neil's paper that he didn't mention, but it's the fact that they think that millennials are more sympathetic to behavioral economics. They're happy to have their employers nudge them, as the title of the recent book that Obama likes so much. Employers nudge them to save and to put their money into 401k plans. If that really is a generational distinctiveness, then it's a very intriguing one. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. My name's Hans Riemer, and I was the National Youth Vote Director for the Obama campaign during the primaries. Started in March of 2007. First, I just wanted to say that I've been involved in the politics of young people, generational politics and such, for a long time, since really the Generation X movement was at its peak. And it was some of the politics of that movement that propelled me to get involved in this arena of American politics. And I am just so happy to see these trends with millennials, because the conversation around the Generation X politics was such a downer. I mean, it was really not fun. It was, for someone of the political orientations perhaps of myself, but you know, being an Xer was sort of a litany of complaints. It was a politics of retrenchment. It was not a lot of fun. So things seem to be changing, and for the better. I just am emboldened by a generation whose motto could be, yes, we can. I mean, that is what I think we all want to see for this country. So, you know, I applaud their arrival on the scene, and I cherish any role that I might have played in helping their arrival come, as many people have. So, my role as the campaign's National Youth Vote Director was primarily to focus in assisting our Iowa operation. I'm really convinced that it was in Iowa, it was the crucible of where the participation was locked in for the primaries, where the techniques were really learned and honed. When I landed on the campaign, it was the most amazing thing. There was already an organization called Students for Barack Obama that had 170 chapters around the country. They had regional directors, they had state directors, political field, communications directors. They had a national staff. They were doing conference calls, you know, regionally by state. They had a field plan in place, and this was all in March They actually had a lot of this in place, you know, in the fall of 2006. So before Mr. Obama had even decided he was going to run. So that organization had sprung out of a draft Obama Facebook page. And the leader of that, Meredith Siegel, took that simple, we want Barack Obama to run for president, and built a national organization. And, you know, had a lot of people involved in doing that, obviously. But to me, that is a testament to what this generation can accomplish, to what the technology is enabling. I don't think when it was, you know, when I was younger, I don't think that was possible. Nothing like that was possible. So there's a lot of evidence for, I think, what we're seeing here today. I'll just touch briefly on some of the exciting things we did for example, in Iowa. But, you know, one of the unique components of the Iowa campaign was the fact that basically all high school seniors were going to be eligible to participate in the caucus. And I was talking to one of the campaign veterans, John Carson. He was the national field director. We were driving to Iowa from Chicago, and he's like, you know, every campaign since the 70s has said, I'm going to win this thing by getting the high school kids out in Iowa. And they all failed. But we have something they don't have. We have Barack Obama, and we got Facebook. You know, generally, I think he was right. I definitely think he was right. Because in Iowa, the dynamics of the caucus are such that there's 500 high schools around the state. If you could get 20 kids from every high school to come out to the caucuses, the 3 or 4 caucuses that might be divided up, you add 2-3 votes into every caucus, and suddenly you could tip the balance. That simple mathematical approach to the possibilities of organizing young people was what empowered and emboldened the campaign to make the kind of effort that was made to get them out to vote, or out to the caucus. So there were staff assigned to the task. You know, we created a social movement. There was a lot of lessons learned from Rock the Vote and that kind of approach to engaging people socially as well as politically. There was a lot of special focus on the young girls who were very engaged in the campaign. A lot of our activists were younger women in the high school teams. They were disproportionately women. A lot of effort given to making it fun and exciting and not just simply a political campaign, but part of a broader social context. And I don't want to overuse the word movement, but it was a movement of young people in Iowa. And I believe that the high school class of 2008 really changed the world because they came out very disproportionately, and young people in Iowa were a huge, they were the margin of victory. It's possible he could have won without them, but they were also the margin of victory. The other gift we were given in Iowa was that college students were sent home. They were home for break, and then they moved the primary up. So again, instead of being concentrated just in the college towns, which we were going to win anyway, they were also dispersed around the state. So when you're looking for reasons for why the youth vote was so powerful in Iowa, that's another key explanation, is that we had young people dispersed all throughout the state. And because of the investment that we put into contacting them and building relationship with them, we were able to turn them out at the caucus. Personally, the question would be, did you see this coming? How did the campaign react? What emboldened them to make these kind of investments? I remember on caucus night, I sent an email to Steve Hildebrand, who was our key early states advisor. I said, thank you for believing in the power of the youth vote. And he said, these Facebookers made me a believer long before this campaign. It sounds a little campy, but, everyone, keen observers, I think, of engagement politics knew that something different was in the works. If you look at the 2004 election results, the youth participation was up. If you looked at 2006, youth participation was up again. I felt very confident that we were going to be successful in getting young people to come out. Partly because I didn't think they were going to come out. I always felt that there was a larger social force that was at work, and that young people their participation was rising. So when you look at that Time magazine, young people care again. That was my mantra in speaking to reporters. What makes you so confident that young people are going to turn out? Well, I'm confident because I believe the evidence shows that young people just care more about being involved and making a difference in this country, and they see politics finally as an avenue for their worthy participation. In my opinion, and I haven't heard this brief touched on too much, although Scott alluded to it or said it, 9/11, I think, was really the moment that awoke, that it was this generation's civic awakening. And it didn't necessarily have to be a political awakening, and it wasn't at first. Political participation in 2002 for young people was no better than it had been in 2000. But I believe that it became a political awakening as it led into Iraq. I think the decision to invade Iraq politicized this generation significantly and created a lot of the momentum for the rising engagement that we saw in 04, 06, and 08. The other factor, the third factor, 9/11 in Iraq, is the internet. Scott talked about the ease of organizing. It's fundamentally the ease of participating. Participating is just easier now than it used to be. Whether that is, how do I register to vote? How do I vote? That information is now easier to find. Our campaign made a complete focus on give them information. When I was the extra debate was, oh, do they care? Oh, do they care? Our thought was, there's a lot of them that care. There's more than enough of them to care to win. We just got to tell them how to participate. And that turned out to be very true. But also the self-organizing tools. As I said, when I arrived in the campaign, there were 170 chapters. That grew to 1,000. In Iowa, there was a chapter at every high school in the state. The only way to do that is if the tools are there for young people to create themselves. And we were just there to kind of coordinate all that. So that was the situation we had. Two comments in reaction to the papers. First, I can't let it go, the conversations about entitlements and such. I look at this very differently. My attitude about the future of social welfare programs, our most important social insurance programs, if you look at the characteristics of the millennial generation, I don't think you could ask for a better context for negotiating these difficult issues. A generation that, and I'll just read, wants to strengthen the community, trust the system, minimize personal risk, support the family, be upbeat and optimistic, make capitalism work better, and so on. these, to me, are the kinds of attributes of a generation that is looking to work through challenges and fundamentally will want to strengthen protections for families rather than retrench on them, which I think is the kind of subtext of that discussion is, do we retrench on these protections or do we expand them? Perhaps remake them, but fundamentally sustain or expand them. I think that Xers that millennials are more of a mind to want to expand them as time passes. The Social Security issue, Scott and I could quibble over that. While it is true that there was some support among young people, it wasn't much. And most young people look at Social Security as, hey, this is something that people really need, and what are you going to do to make sure it's still there? That's the attitude that people have about it, in my opinion. The last point is the one about coherence of the generation. By all accounts, boomers should be dominating our political system, but if they split their votes 50-50, as I think they were close to doing in this last election, then in a way they don't really exist. So the question of, do young people maintain this lopsided margin, that is really going to be the key question of whether they change the political system, whether they elect leaders that they want. So during the election, my comment to reporters who would ask me that was, well, we'll see. I wouldn't certainly make any prediction that that another candidate couldn't come along and steal back the thunder. But the statistics that we've seen and the arguments we've seen from Neil Howe and Rena Nadler, which I just really enjoyed, really make me think a little bit differently and perhaps a little bit more hopeful on that score. So thank you.
Thanks. Why don't we have the authors come back up? Thanks, Hans. All right. Well, tremendous insight all across the board, and I really appreciate those of you all of you who've stuck around and the input from our guests. We were scheduled to go through to 1:45, and I don't know how that's going to affect our friends from C-SPAN, but we're at about 1:40 now. So those of you who want to stay, provided our guests can give us an extra 15 minutes or so, I'd like to open this up to questions. With C-SPAN and with the web broadcast that we're doing, we do want to make sure that you have a microphone before you ask your question. So Danny will find you. Sir.
Carl Ankowski, I'm with one of those organizations that millennials like, apparently. That's the State Department. And the question I have is more an academic one, actually, and it relates to ferreting out the life cycle effect from the other effects that you've been discussing. The real problem in a generation that is only a few years old is how do you know where they're going to go and how do you know how they're going to change? So what gives you confidence that what we're seeing in the millennials is not part of a life cycle effect rather than a generational effect?
I'll say one word about it, which is, of course, we don't know. We really don't know. I would emphasize that the future is unpredictable, and it much will depend on things like what happens with the Obama administration's success in dealing with the problems it faces. Our piece of evidence is simply that the starting point for these past several generations has been important to where they end up. So it's not washed out by either the, gradual conservatism, growing conservatism of each generation, or the effects of big events. It remains significant. But it's only based on 3 or so previous cohorts. So.
One thing I often like to do is to look at historical parallels. That is to say, go back in time and look at other generations that started out the same way. Just as we look at millennials and we look at their participation, community service learning, all the stuff they're doing, even as teens, even before they were voting age, and how that contributed and how that continues to contribute to their higher voter participation and engagement in politics. An interesting parallel is the greatest generation. Back when they were kids, back in the 2000 to 1900 to about 1925, this was the generation that turned out to be a political powerhouse during the New Deal. We don't have precise. This was before we took age-graded polling of any exactitude, but it's estimated that 85% of this generation voted for the Democratic Party, for FDR, for the New Deal. This was the first generation of African Americans to vote for the Democratic Party, for example. And I think you could have had a case if we could go back and do the voting where we would have found, just as Hans was saying, that older generations basically did a 50-50 tie, and the GI generation basically decided the outcome. But you look at how they started out. These GIs, which were protected during the progressive era, all of those pasteurized milk and vitamin pills and everything they were given, child labor laws and Harrison Drug Act, they were the first Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. They were the first 4-H clubbers and campfire girls. In the early 1920s, they were the first Miss Americas. Everyone associated them during their college days, even before they made their impact on politics, with this new image of a civic-minded young person. And I'm trying to support this idea of looking at these cohort effects early in childhood, and the importance also, when you can, of looking at history itself and finding the appropriate parallel.
And just to follow up for our folks who are a little more tuned to the political side of things, how does the Republican Party take the information that's included in these reports and the polling and the voting trends? Is there a way for them to cut into this advantage? Hans, you may not want to see that, but is there a way? It's certainly something they're thinking about.
I mean, I think there is. What can I say? I just think that they're always up for grabs, and there will always be events that shape people's consciousness and candidates that shape people's consciousness and that excite them more. So, who could have foreseen 6 years ago what this election's dynamics would be? And, for example, I always thought John McCain was their best shot to capture the youth vote. And he might have been. I think if he had played himself out over differently in the last few years. But, one could see a different race with John McCain against a different candidate that wouldn't have resulted in the same kind of split. So I think Barack Obama was an extraordinary candidate as far as that partisan divide. But they're going to have to figure out how to take back at least 10 or 15 points, because they can't lose by 30 points going forward.
Great. Other questions? Mark? Right.
Hey, Mark Schmidt, The American Prospect and New America. I'm always glad to be at an event that puts the beginning of Gen X not in 1965. I like to be solidly within it. One of the things I've been puzzling over recently is the use of the word populist, the self-description populist, especially among younger progressives, bloggers, and so forth. And everything about the data suggests that that this generation has nothing in common with any of the characteristics we associate with populism: contempt for elites, contempt for expertise, a kind of desire for a kind of sharp fight in your politics. And I wonder, is that sort of a limited group? How does that concept of populism kind of fit into the politics of this generation?
I guess it's already on. So that's an interesting point, and I think many of the things you associate, contempt for elites, and also, for better or for worse, the divisiveness we often associate with populism. And it's us versus them. We think of William Jennings Bryan, right? And we think of these firebrands when we think of populism. Riemer made the interesting point that Jonathan Edwards, who was the closest thing, I think, to a populist candidate in the primaries, never caught on with millennials. I went on many blogs. We tried to track the data. And you went to the rallies, and they were boomers. They were boomers at those rallies. And that message of, you got to punish the rich. It's not just enough to tax them. You got to make them hurt, for the world to become a better place. That never really caught on. Instead, they were much more drawn to the sort of milder consensus and consensus-oriented optimism of a candidate like Obama. So I think that's an interesting observation.
Peter, let me ask you, you're on a campus, so you see millennials and budding millennials on a daily basis and have seen their predecessors. Is it tangible? Do you see that difference that's described in these reports?
I think I do, but I just want to emphasize how completely unrepresentative the students in my campus are. But to start with, their four-year college students, so that puts them in top 25% socioeconomically. Their family incomes are very, very high. It was a selective place. We have actually very hard data that 92% of them voted in the election because a student group did a study and actually checked the voter records. So you got a 92% turnout. But it's just really important. And yeah, they're totally jazzed. And they're also patriotic, something that was mentioned here. So, for example, on the night, I wasn't there, but on the night they all gathered in the center part of campus, and then they marched down to Davis Square in Somerville singing the national anthem, which is perfectly in line with what we've been saying, and very politically significant since these kids are voting at enormous rates and will be leaders. I just don't think that they are anywhere near the average.
Just let me comment quickly on a point, because you brought it up about college versus non-college millennials and how different they are. And on the question of volunteering, for example, I serve on the board of Youth Serve America, and we do a lot of work with kids who serve in the inner city, minorities. In fact, a lot of it was started by Colin Powell and his American Promise organization. I really take exception to that. I mean, we have seen a huge turnout of volunteering in urban minorities. And in fact, when sometimes people tell me a lot of these positive trends, these are just upper class or suburban collegiate trends. In fact, if you look at many of the indicators that I showed earlier, decline in crime, decline in drug use, decline in teen pregnancy, increasing academic achievement, the increasing prevalence of two-parent families, on a percentage basis, this is much more a marked trend in minorities than it is among the kind of predominantly white middle class. If there is a lagging if there's a lagging segment to the millennial generation, it's rural. Predominantly white, but rural. In fact, many areas of drug abuse, for the first time, we are seeing higher abuse in rural areas, obviously most kind of dramatically the meth epidemic, but in other areas as well. It's really the rural America which is probably most behind on many of these trends. We've tried to break them down and look at them by region. Anyway, I just wanted to add that on the non-college kids.
I don't know how much everybody's interested in this, but I mean, I agree with a lot of that, and there's some very important points in there, one of which is that if you offer working class and urban kids structured, positive opportunities, they respond very, very well, of course, and it's very moving. The total social investment in that, though, is very small. So the numbers are great if you're in the nonprofit sector and you're organizing these projects, but if you go the other way and you look at what's the typical profile, the civic engagement indicators, which include voting and volunteering and trust, but also membership in groups, even membership in unions, dramatically have diverged since the 1970s, with declines for both groups, but very deep declines for the non-college. So I mean, it's a complicated picture, and there's all kinds of things going on. But one other thing is, if you take something like the decline in weapons, taking weapons to school. So that's great. And in a different kind of context conversation, I'd be emphasizing that. It's a big decline. Still, though, you were showing on your graph 10% of kids taking weapons to school regularly. So there's a lot of schools out there where there's a lot of weapons. So, and there's a lot of kids in those schools. There's also a third who aren't even in the survey because they're not in high school left. So there's a big group that we're leaving out that's not some really marginal, minor group that we need to figure out how to get them back on the college track. It's a reality of a lot of young people. That's not a coddled environment.
Yeah. Yes, maybe you had a question? Here. One sec for the mic.
Hi, I'm Laura Eisensee. I'm with the Dallas Morning News. There's been a lot of talk and data about the millennials' participation in the election and voter turnout. But I'm really curious about your thoughts on translating that energy into policy with Congress and the administration. What are your thoughts on that in general? What challenges do you see? Have you seen any signs so far in the administration that there's sort of a translation of that campaign energy into more policy stuff?
Well, I'll start, but the challenge of organizations representing this demographic continuing the momentum and translating it into policy it's a big challenge indeed. And there are a few organizations in this realm, but there's not that many. So it's, they're going to have a big task on their hands. It's not easy. So I don't really have any brilliant observation here other than I do think we've seen an effort to fund some of their priorities. Education was a huge piece of the stimulus, for example. There's already been a lot of efforts around textbooks for students, tuition, and I think those kind of things will continue. As Peter would probably say, not hitting the whole segment of the population, but I generally think that the people in the majority in Congress are aware that they are there in part thanks to this group of people, and they should deliver on some promises. Who's there to hold them accountable and push that message? There's only a few groups to do it, so it's going to be a tough challenge.
When Hans was talking earlier about Gen Xers and their efforts to become politically organized and how depressing it all was, I have many Gen X friends, and throughout the 1990s, they were always trying to organize politically. And one of them came out with a report in the year 2000 called Neglection 2000. I thought, what a great Gen X title for a report, Neglection 2000. Very downbeat. And what they described was a vicious cycle. We tune out, therefore the politicians spend no money on us. They don't try to get in touch with us. They don't really care what we think. Therefore, we continue to tune out. Therefore, they continue not to care, right? In other words, I think what may have started is the beginning of a positive cycle. In other words, we care, therefore they are going to actively care and connect with what we think, and they're going to try to make sure that we approve. And it's going to be very interesting to see how Congress, for example, or the administration behaves right now, looking forward to the 2010 and 2012 elections. That's going to be their incentive for being proactive in connecting themselves.
One other thing that you mentioned was there being very few organizations that actually, work towards this formally. But that brings up what you mentioned about the organization across the country of the youth by themselves through Facebook. And I think that's something that we've seen very strongly here and can fairly safely predict that at least is a good possibility in the future. If there's an issue that millennials truly care about, they have the tools and the propensity to organize themselves through this technology. And that speaks to something else that I believe you brought up, which is, millennials' relationship with technology and what that means. And I think we often talk about how millennials have been shaped by all this technology that's been available to us. A much more interesting question in my mind is how millennials have been shaping the use of this technology, right? Every new generation, in fact, comes of age with new technologies. Boomers were the first children to have televisions, the first young adults to have personal computers. Every generation has that experience, and the question is, how do they use that? How do they use it to empower themselves? So look at boomers with personal computers. They hunker down in their own individual little workstations, having their individual creative ideas and discussing their inner souls to their computer. Millennials are connecting with each other. They're using all of the networking technology available, and that's the technology that we talk about because that's what they're using and that's the way they're using it. So in that way, I think that the technology will empower millennials to organize themselves.
One thing I want to add is one of the shifts that we consciously made within this sector was that we don't want to ghettoize young people as what's the youth agenda and is Congress moving on the youth agenda. The issues that young people cared about in this election were Iraq, the economy, the environment. So if Congress takes some action on global warming, that's checking a pretty big box for young people. So the fact that you may not see a document called the youth agenda, nailed to the wall of Nancy Pelosi's office doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a lot of progress being made. So, and I think it's when we look for that kind of compartmentalized agenda that we start to feel a little bit more frustrated.
Scott, on the technology issue and particularly on polling, I've heard that it's become more difficult to reach people who predominantly use cell phones. So the technology allows those who are more savvy with it to avoid pollsters and your ilk. So
That's true even of baby boomers.
Sure.
Finally figured out how to use caller ID.
But your masking technologies are leaping their caller ID technologies.
Well,
I'm sure.
the biggest problem that we've faced with respect to technology is just the growth in the number of people who can only be reached by a cell phone. I mean, many of you may know that surveys up until the past year or so have been conducted solely on landline phones, and we're now to the point where well over a third of young people are cell phone only. And leaving out a third of this very important political demographic in this election just wasn't an option for us. So we've included cell phone samples in our surveys, which are very expensive to do, but we thought were essential. And I think this is going to become standard practice by survey researchers. We actually don't find that people are reluctant to talk with us if we can get through that barrier of the caller ID. And even households that we call, or people that we call on their cell phones who don't answer the first or second time eventually will, and we have a reasonably good chance of getting them.
We have time for one last question. Yes.
Thanks, I'm Brad Rourke. I just want to key in on the notion of one of the key characteristics of the millennials being that they're striving for decorum and consensus. And the hard edges of politics are dying a difficult death these days. And I just wanted to ask you to respond to that gap and prognosticate on how the millennials might respond to it.
Well, as a millennial myself, I suppose I can say I find the death throes of partisanship, if we can call it that, very unattractive. But I think it's difficult, and I think we could have seen this coming. You know, in a campaign, the youth demographic got to articulate its ideals, and now as politicians, fallible politicians, try to actualize them, it's much, much more difficult. I think it's going to be a media war, and I think one sign that this is a new generation that's arrived is something that you mentioned, which is that politicians are aware that part of winning that media war is winning over the millennials who have this priority. And so that positive cycle, I believe, has begun. Things haven't gone so well so far in terms of bipartisanship, but everybody, the media, politicians, citizens are aware that it's a new priority, and I think we'll have to see, you know, which side sort of comes out on top of that.
It's going to take a while to catch on. I mean, millennials don't call the shots in the media. They're being called by boomers and Xers who love that kind of carnival culture thing, you know, where everyone's yelling at each other and stuff. So, in other words, that's their entertainment. Millennials are a little bit of a sideshow commercially. But when I go and see, Riemer mentioned, for example, what we find on college campuses, the disinterest in millennials in passionate debate with each other. Another thing that I get, I often have people call me, journalists, you know, call me about millennials, and they often comment that when they go out and interview millennials on high schools or college campuses, that a group of them will not want to give their own answer. They all confer among themselves to give a common answer. They go quickly on their IM so that they all have like one answer to give. Okay. Well, this now a lot of boomers just scary. You know, what does that mean? You know, but the suppression of individuality and the desire to give a group response, I think, clearly is pointing to a very different kind of media and a very different kind of political discourse. You know, 10 or 15 years from now.
Well, please join me in thanking our guests, and thank you for attending.